We live inside a story that says outcomes are earned, that wealth is a reward and poverty is a verdict, that if you're struggling, the fault is ultimately yours, because the system is fair and the rules are clear and anyone who plays the game well enough wins. We don't say this out loud usually, but we feel it. Every time someone loses a job and immediately wonders what they did wrong. Every time we look at a homeless person and assume, even for a second, that a series of bad decisions put them there. This story has a name. Sociologists call it the meritocratic ideal, and it's one of the defining psychological burdens of modern life. But it wasn't always like this. For most of Western history, people understood something that we have almost entirely forgotten, that a great deal of life is simply out of your hands. The Romans didn't just accept this, they worshipped it. They built temples to it, prayed to it before battle, carved its image on coins and painted it on walls. They had a goddess whose entire domain was the part of your life you could not control, no matter how talented or hardworking or virtuous you were. Her name was Fortuna, and the story of how we forgot her explains a lot about why we are so anxious, so burnt out, and so quietly cruel to people who fail. Fortuna was not a minor deity. She was not some quaint superstition that Romans nodded to on their way to more serious gods. She was enormous. At Praeneste, about 20 miles east of Rome, her temple complex was one of the largest religious structures in the ancient world, a terraced sanctuary carved into an entire hillside. Generals visited before campaigns, emperors associated themselves with her image. Ordinary people kept small statues of her in household shrines, right alongside the family gods that watched over the hearth. She appears everywhere in Roman life. Soldiers prayed to her before battle. Merchants invoked her before sea voyages, because no amount of navigational skill could save you from a storm. On June 24th, the festival of Fors Fortuna, Romans floated downriver to her temples, performed rituals, and rode back drunk and garlanded. She was woven into the texture of daily existence in a way that is hard for modern people to fully appreciate. In art, she's usually shown holding a cornucopia in one hand, a symbol of abundance, and a ship's rudder in the other, representing her power to steer the course of human lives. But the most revealing detail is what she stands on. Roman artists place her on top of a globe, a sphere that could roll out from under her at any moment. The meaning was explicit. Everything she gives you is unstable. The ground beneath fortune is always shifting. And Fortuna was indifferent. She did not care whether you were good or bad, brave or cowardly, hardworking or lazy. She distributed her gifts and her disasters with no regard for merit whatsoever. The Romans had a saying for this: Fortuna cieca est. Fortune is blind. She couldn't see you even if she wanted to. This is a radically different way of understanding the world than the one we live with today. When a Roman fleet was destroyed by a storm, they understood that the sea belongs to Fortuna. When a farmer's crop failed because of drought, his neighbors didn't assume he was a bad farmer. They recognized that rainfall was beyond human control. There was a category of experience that simply fell outside the domain of personal responsibility, and Fortuna ruled over it. The Stoics thought about this extensively. Seneca, writing in the 1st century, essentially built an entire philosophical system around the problem of Fortuna. His answer was psychological armor. Prepare for the worst. Enjoy nothing too much. Remind yourself constantly that everything you have can be taken away, and Fortuna loses her power over you. The fact that one of Rome's greatest thinkers devoted so much energy to coping with Fortuna tells you how seriously the Romans took her. You don't build elaborate defenses against something you consider trivial. But Seneca's project also reveals a tension at the heart of Roman life. The Romans didn't simply accept Fortuna and give up. They paired her with another concept, one that ran just as deep in their culture, and the relationship between these two ideas shaped how they understood success, failure, and what it meant to live well. That concept was virtus. Virtus is usually translated as virtue, but that English word has been so thoroughly domesticated by Christianity that it barely captures what the Romans meant. For a Roman, virtus was closer to something like excellence in action, courage on the battlefield, skill in oratory, discipline in governance, the ability to rise to a moment when a moment demanded rising. It came from vir, meaning man, and it carried all the weight of Roman expectations about what a man was supposed to be when the situation called for it. But virtus had a boundary. It described what you did with the circumstances you were given. It did not promise that your circumstances or the outcome would cooperate. A general could train his army brilliantly, plan his campaign with precision, and choose his ground with care. That was virtus. Whether a storm scattered his fleet the night before battle was Fortuna's business. The Roman worldview held both of these truths simultaneously. You were absolutely expected to cultivate excellence, and you were absolutely expected to understand that excellence alone could not guarantee results. This is a distinction that many today have almost completely lost. In modern life, effort and outcome have been fused together so tightly that they feel like the same thing. If you worked hard and failed, you must not have worked hard enough, or smart enough, or in the right way. The possibility that you did everything right and the world simply didn't cooperate barely registers as an option. And crucially, virtus was not what we would now call hustle culture. The Romans didn't admire a man who filled every waking hour with productivity. A Roman who displayed tremendous virtus on the battlefield or in the Senate and then went home to read philosophy in his garden or spent time at the bath chatting was the ideal. The good life required action when action was called for and leisure when it wasn't. Constant busyness would have struck a Roman as a kind of sickness, a failure to understand what life was actually for. With both of these concepts in hand, something important comes into focus. The Romans had a very specific word for someone who had done their best and still lost. Infortunatus, literally without fortune. If your farm flooded, if your ship sank, if your business collapsed despite genuine effort, you were infortunatus, and the social response to this was pity, not contempt. Your neighbors understood that the gods were fickle, that Fortuna's wheel turns, that the man who was prosperous today could be ruined tomorrow through no fault of his own. Compare that to the modern world for someone who fails, loser. The word itself carries moral judgment. A loser isn't someone who was unlucky. A loser is someone who is personally deficient. Something in their character, their discipline, their intelligence wasn't good enough. We don't pity losers. We look away from them because their failure feels contagious, and because deep down we need to believe that we are different from them, that our success is solid, that whatever happened to them could never happen to us. This had consequences at the top of the social ladder too. Roman elites who achieved success were expected to hold it loosely. When a general was awarded a triumph, the most spectacular public honor Rome could bestow, a slave rode behind him in the chariot whispering a reminder, "You are mortal." Because Fortuna's wheels turn in both directions. The man who stands at the top today sits at the bottom tomorrow. Roman success was celebrated, but it was never fully trusted, because everyone understood the force that had helped deliver it. There is something psychologically healthy in this. If your success is partly a gift from a blind goddess, you don't have to carry the full weight of it on your own shoulders. You can enjoy it without the gnawing suspicion that you don't truly deserve it. And if your failure is partly the work of that same blind goddess, you don't have to destroy yourself trying to figure out what you did wrong. Sometimes the wheel just turned. Now, none of this should be mistaken for universal compassion. The Romans were a deeply hierarchical society, and they could be vicious about status. The pity they extended to the infortunatus did not extend to the genuinely idle. A man who had no virtus at all, who simply refused to act when action was required, earned contempt just as readily in Rome as anywhere else. The Roman framework wasn't soft. It simply drew the line between blame and sympathy in a different place than we do. But the framework worked. For centuries, it gave people a way to make sense of a world that is deeply unpredictable. It acknowledged effort without fetishizing outcomes. It allowed for compassion without abandoning standards. And it lasted, in one form or another, for a remarkably long time. In 524 AD, a man named Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius sat in a prison cell in Pavia waiting to be executed. Not long before, he had been one of the most powerful men in the Western world. He served as Magister Officiorum under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, a position roughly equivalent to Chief of Staff. He was wealthy, respected, deeply educated, and from one of Rome's most distinguished families. His sons had both been appointed consuls. By every measure available to a Roman aristocrat, Boethius had won. And then, very quickly, he lost everything. He was accused of treason and conspiracy. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. His former allies abandoned him. He was stripped of his titles, his property, his freedom, and finally his life. Theodoric had him imprisoned, tortured, and eventually clubbed to death. In the months between his sentencing and his execution, Boethius wrote a book. It's called The Consolation of Philosophy, and it became one of the most widely read texts of the next 1,000 years. The setup was deceptively simple. Boethius, alone in his cell, is visited by a woman. She is Lady Philosophy, and she has come to talk him through his despair. He pours out his grief. He did nothing wrong. He served with honor and loyalty, and yet here he is, ruined and about to die. How can the world be this unjust? Philosophy's answer is blunt. She tells him he has been a fool. He entrusted his happiness to Fortuna, and Fortuna owes him nothing. Her wheel turns, that's what it does. The gifts she gave him were never truly his. They were loans, and she has called them in. To rage against this is to rage against the nature of the world itself. What makes the text so powerful is that Boethius clearly knows this already. He is one of the most educated men of his era. He translated Aristotle. He understood Stoic philosophy. He could have written philosophy's arguments himself on any ordinary afternoon, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it in a prison cell when you're waiting to die are entirely different experiences. The Consolation is the record of a man trying to make his own wisdom real at the moment it actually matters. The book was copied, translated, and passed hand to hand across medieval Europe for centuries. King Alfred the Great translated it into Old English. Chaucer adapted parts of it. It appeared in monastery libraries and royal courts alike. The image of Fortuna's wheel, Rota Fortunae, which Boethius did more than anyone to cement in the Western imagination, became one of the defining symbols of the medieval worldview. You can find it carved into cathedral floors, illuminated in manuscripts, referenced in poems and songs. For 1,000 years, if you wanted to talk about the instability of earthly success, you reach for Boethius. He stands at a turning point. He is the last major voice in the Western tradition to take Fortuna fully seriously as a framework for understanding human suffering. After him, the story changes, not all at once and not cleanly, but the slow, centuries-long process that would eventually strip Fortuna of her power and replace her with something far less forgiving was already underway. And it started with a single, seemingly reasonable idea that suffering might have a purpose. Christianity did not kill Fortuna overnight. For centuries, the two coexisted uneasily. Early Christians still lived in a world shaped by Roman assumptions, and the feeling that life was unpredictable and largely beyond human control didn't vanish just because people started going to Mass. But Christianity introduced a concept that would slowly, over generations, hollow Fortuna out from the inside. That concept was Divine Providence. Providence said that nothing happens without God's knowledge and consent. There is no randomness, no blind chance, no indifferent goddess rolling dice with human lives. Everything that happens to you is part of a plan. The plan may be mysterious, it may be painful, you may never understand it in this lifetime, but it is there, and it is authored by a God who is neither blind nor indifferent. This was in many ways a comfort. If your child died, it wasn't the senseless cruelty of a spinning wheel. God had reasons. If your harvest failed, God was testing your faith, refining your soul, preparing you for something you couldn't yet see. Suffering under Fortuna was meaningless. Suffering under Providence had a purpose, even if the purpose was hidden. But Providence also did something subtle and profound. It began to moralize outcomes. If God controls everything, and God is just, then what happens to you starts to reflect something about your relationship with God. If you are prosperous, perhaps God is rewarding you. If you are poor, perhaps God is punishing you, or testing you, or withholding his blessings for reasons that trace back to your own spiritual condition. The connection is loose, hedged with theological caveats, wrapped in the language of mystery. But it is there, and once that connection exists, even in a tentative form, the psychological distance between unfortunate and deserving begins to shrink. For most of the medieval period, this stayed manageable. The church still taught that the poor were blessed, that wealth was spiritually dangerous, that the last would be first. A peasant could be closer to God than a king. The theology cut against any simple equation between prosperity and righteousness. Fortuna's wheel was still spinning in the background, preserved by Boethius, acknowledged in sermons and poetry and art. The system was messy, contradictory, and in many ways psychologically livable. The Reformation changed that. Martin Luther and John Calvin didn't set out to invent the modern meritocracy, but the theology they unleashed pushed hard in that direction. Calvin, in particular, developed the doctrine of predestination, the idea that God has already chosen who will be saved and who will be damned, and that nothing you do can change it. On its face, this should have produced fatalism. If the outcome is decided, why bother trying? But the opposite happened. Because no one knew whether they were among the elect, people searched desperately for signs of God's favor. And the most visible sign, the one you could point to and measure, was worldly success. If your business thrived, if your fields produced, if your household was orderly and prosperous, maybe that meant God had chosen you. The sociologist Max Weber traced this connection in his famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Work became a calling, idleness became a sin, and prosperity became, quietly, a form of spiritual evidence. This was the real break. Under Fortuna, a rich man and a poor man were separated by luck. Under Providence, they were separated by a mystery. Under the Protestant ethic, they were separated by something that looked increasingly like moral worth. The rich man worked harder, lived more virtuously, and God rewarded him. The poor man was lazy, dissolute, or simply unfavored, and his poverty was the proof. The Enlightenment finished the job. Once science and reason replaced God as the governing framework of the universe, the theological scaffolding fell away, but the moral logic remained. If the world is rational and knowable, if the markets are efficient and systems are fair, then outcomes must reflect inputs. Success is the product of talent and effort. Failure is the product of their absence. There is no Fortuna. There is no Providence. There is only you, your choices, and their consequences. This is the world we live in now. We have replaced the blind goddess with the market, the algorithm, the economy. We talk about these forces as though they are rational systems that reward merit and punish incompetence. But the Romans would have recognized them instantly. They are Fortuna wearing new clothes. Blind, indifferent, impossibly powerful, and utterly unconcerned whether you deserve what she gives you or what she takes away. The difference is that the Romans knew it. They looked at Fortuna in the face and said, "You are real, you are powerful, and I cannot control you." We look at the same forces and insist they are fair, and when they crush someone, we assume that person had it coming. The psychologist Melvin Lerner spent decades studying this instinct. He called it the just world hypothesis, the deeply ingrained human need to believe that people get what they deserve. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Lerner found that this belief is so powerful that people will actually blame victims of random misfortune rather than accept that the misfortune was truly random. It is easier to believe that someone earned their suffering than to sit with the terrifying possibility that suffering is arbitrary. And the exact opposite is true too. We look at the richest people in society and assume they got there solely through hard work and cunning decisions, while ignoring the sheer amount of luck involved. After all, we call wealth a fortune for a reason. Good fortune leads to great fortune. The Romans had a healthier relationship with that unpredictability and lack of control. They didn't pretend it away, they built it a temple and gave it a name. So where does that leave us? We can't go back to Fortuna's world, and we wouldn't want to. Remember, the Romans themselves had a deeply hierarchical society, and they were obsessed with rank and status. But we can stop pretending that the world we built in her absence is as rational and fair as we tell ourselves it is. We need to remember what the Romans understood, that you can prepare the ship and still lose it to the storm, that effort is real and luck is also real, and that the two are not the same thing, and confusing them makes us cruel. Cruel to others when they fail, cruel to ourselves when we do. Recognizing Fortuna doesn't mean giving up. It means holding your success a little more loosely and other people's failures with a little more grace. It means allowing for the possibility that the man sleeping under the overpass didn't arrive there through some perfect chain of personal failures, and that you didn't arrive where you are through some perfect chain of personal virtues. The wheel turns, it always has, so we should have a little more compassion for the unfortunate, even those who made bad decisions along the way, because there are always circumstances beyond one's control. And for those of us who do make it to the top of the mountain, it's good to feel accomplished and enjoy the fruits, but it's dangerous to let it feed our ego. At any point, Fortuna can take it all away. Thank you so much for watching. This was Folks of Yore. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button, subscribing, and leave a comment about your thoughts. You all have been leaving such thoughtful comments, so please keep them coming. They're a joy to read through. Thanks again. See you next time.